Good morning, everybody. My name is Mahtis Keshavars. I am the founder and director of the Make Agency, and we are a PR and strategy company based out of New York and Los Angeles. I welcome you all to today's conversation around caste and colorism, challenging the standards for love in biased societies. Many of us spent the past few weeks binge watching the global phenomenon known as Indian matchmaking. This show hits a chord for many, but especially for immigrant communities of color for whom the issue of arranged marriages remain quite prevalent. In the shadow of the discourse around the show, two other reckonings have been taking place. Those following the news in the US noted a Cisco employee in Silicon Valley has been suing the company for failing to protect him against intercaste discrimination at work. The case amplifies the fact that caste systems are an active form of discrimination that persists not only in India, but within the Indian American diaspora as well. Secondly, the Unilever's Fair and Lovely brand announced that all skincare products under its umbrella would have the words fairness, whitening, and lightening removed. And Shaadi.com agreed following a petition to remove the color filter from its dating and marriage website. In light of these developments, both new and historical, we have an incredible lineup of women today and leaders to talk about the issue of caste as it continues to be exported among diaspora communities. And similarly, as many South Asian and other brown communities align themselves with the movement for Black lives, the question remains, how do we highlight the hypocrisy of colorism among our own societies? So I want to introduce our incredible panelists today. I will begin with Meena Varma because we share a position on the Council for Minority Rights Group International. She is the director of the Dalit Solidarity Network, which provides overall leadership for IDSN strategy towards the end of eliminating caste discrimination. She is also the chair of the Minority Rights Group International and has been a board member and treasurer of the Ethical Trading Initiative. Smriti Mundhra is an Academy Award-winning director and producer. Her latest film, St. Louis Superman, was nominated for a 2020 Academy Award in the short documentary category. And her debut feature, a precursor that brings us all here today, is a documentary called A Suitable Girl, which I encourage everyone to watch. It premiered in competition in the 2017 Tribeca Film Festival, and she is a creator and executive producer of Indian Matchmaking. Christina Dhanaraj is a corporate professional with over 12 years of experience working and living around the globe. She is also a consultant for women and minority-led initiatives, focusing on social justice, self-determination, and collaborative models of scholarship. She is currently an advisor for Smashboard and was formerly the co-founder of the Dalit History Month Project and a volunteer for Dalit Women Fight. Thenmozhi Soundarajan is a Dalit American artist, technologist, and the executive director of Equality Labs, an art and technology startup supporting South Asian religious, cultural, genderqueer communities in the United States and South Asia. Through her work, she organizes communities to fight impunity, state violence, anti-Blackness, caste apartheid, and religious intolerance. I welcome each of you wonderful sisters to this conversation. I wanted to start with you, Smriti, of maybe giving us a brief overview of how Indian matchmaking came about and some of the challenges and shortcomings that you faced in the creative process and since.
Sure. First of all, thank you for hosting this and having me here. I'm so honored and excited to be here and dialogue with all of these wonderful women. Indian matchmaking started as in a meeting at Netflix, shortly after A Suitable Girl premiered and won an award at the Tribeca Film Festival. This was around in late 2017, and at that time, Netflix was pre-launch in India. They were just at the brink of really ramping up their global content offerings. And they, India was a big focus, for Netflix at the time. So they asked me, to pitch them ideas about, things to make in India, particularly in the nonfiction space, which is very, in terms of mass consumption, it's still very emerging in India. And I pitched them an idea about, diving into the marriage industrial complex and our specific, entanglement with the idea of marriage and matchmaking through the lens of one particular matchmaker who I had known for a very long time. And that's how, it took a long time to put the show together. It was, the format is very different than I think we've seen either in the West or in India in terms of dating shows. It's not quite reality. It's not quite, you know, fully documentary. It's somewhere in between. And so the idea was to really, to have all the participants be real people, you know, who are actual clients of the matchmaker and, you know, who are going through this process in a genuine way, and not sort of casting for people who would typically respond to casting calls for reality TV. But, you know, it was tough, you know, to get people to really agree to open up on camera about this very vulnerable, typically very private, you know, part of life. And I'm grateful for the ones who did. But it was tough to put the show together for the first season, but I'm optimistic if we're lucky enough to continue making the show, we can do even more now that we've done it once.
Smriti, the show has been super popular, and I think it spent quite a few weeks within the first top 10 things of lists of things to watch on Netflix, which is no small feat for a woman of color to create something like this. But it's also been met with some controversy and some backlash on it. And I thought I would turn it over to Meena to kind of give a little bit of context to some of the concerns that people have raised around the show, and then go from there.
Oh, no.
Sorry, delighted to see this glorious, glorious imbalance agenda. And I'm just delighted to be here. And Madis, amazing. Thank you so much for pulling all this together. And I think kind of reflecting kind of on what you've just said, Smriti, but also having, you know, admitting to having binge watched the whole series, almost through hands like this, and the excuses, as far as I was concerned, was kind of research, but it was did raise so many questions for me, because what it exposed is everything it didn't say, and to me, I think that was the main thing. I mean, you're around this table now with some amazing women that will have obviously things to say about this, but I think, you know, what it didn't say, but what it implied very, very clearly was the casteism, sexism, racism, you know, and colorism. I mean, everybody on that program was extremely fair. There was no mention of caste. There was no mention of color. And one of the participants, whose sister was married to an African American. That was just glossed over. He was just an American man. And it was just like completely missed that nobody raised this, despite her father sort of talking about who her next partner should be. So, and I think that was the thing for me. I don't know how much of that was cut. I understand there would have been difficulties and sensitivities, but there are sensitivities outside of that space that I think there was an opportunity to maybe address, and I'd like to see, you know, when we kind of go through this conversation, maybe how a new series could expose the realities, because, you know, we're talking very rich, very pale, very privileged people, and, you know, I think it's really important that that is not a reality for 90% of any population, whether it be in the US diaspora, the UK diaspora, or back in India. So, you know, I think throwing that in as part of the conversation today is something that I'd like to unpick a little bit more.
So, Thenmozhi, I wanted to ask you a question in this, because you've written and spoken so extensively about the Dalit experience in India, and how that kind of gets also exported to different communities. And I wanted to hear, for people to hear a little bit from you about how the lack of racial, class, and queer kind of sexual diversity among those represented in the show kind of reinforces some painful stereotypes for folks. Did we just lose Thenmozhi? Christina, maybe I can turn it to you then until we get Thenmozhi back.
Yeah, please.
Sure. And Christina, you actually, I should say, have written really beautifully and eloquently about being a Dalit woman and in the dating world. So I thought maybe you could give a little bit of insight and experience as to what that is like for people who aren't seeing everything through the lens of Indian Matchmaking show.
Sure, of course. I kind of agree what Meena said, I binge watched the show as well, and it was kind of a hate binge watching, you might say, because I found it very entertaining, I must say, but also very triggering at different levels, because I grew up in India as a Dalit woman, and I've been through this process myself, both as an individual and our family has been through this process, and it was a terribly humiliating and a terribly horrible experience to go through the system of arranged marriage, where time and time again, the offers that come through people and mothers of boys and parents and families would try to continuously probe and ask you your caste, right? It did not matter who we were, how educated we were, how attractive we were, or how loving we would be if there was a match that happened, but caste mattered so much. In fact, I wrote about this in my Twitter thread, where there was this one time when we went through this process, and the mother of that boy was very happy with everything that we had spoken about, and that entire interaction happened on the phone. So there was no way in that time, there was no way for them to, do a Google search or find us on Facebook and to understand where we came from. But from the interaction on the phone, there was no way for them to, land on which caste we came from. But the moment they saw us, it was something that they could not handle, and so they very, very easily kind of placed us as Dalits. And the reaction that we had to go through after that was extremely terrible. And so what happened to me when I was watching the show was, it was entertaining because I was getting a peek into how the rich gets married, how the upper caste gets married, what kind of, interactions happen, how funny they are, mothers ordering mimosas and all of that. All of that was fun to watch. But on the other side, it was an extremely triggering experience because it took me through a spiral of the experiences that I've had. And quite, surely a lot of my sisters from the same community would have gone through similar experiences as well. Mm-hmm. Secondly, one thing that I wanted to ask you, and I've been following some of the ways in which you've been reacting and responding to the criticism that has come in the form of, articles and writings and Twitter threads. And in one reaction, you had mentioned how it was Seema's world. And as Meena rightly pointed out, there was no one who was not pale-skinned. Clearly, there was no one from a Dalit background or from a Muslim background or from an LGBTIQ+ background. And the way you had responded to that was, it's Seema's world, and it would seem extremely, inorganic to bring someone in and ask her to find that match for that person. But what I felt when I read that reaction from your side was, why was it important to tell Seema's story? Because when I was growing up, I was constantly being exposed to movies and pop culture that did not talk about my story, that did not talk about my people. So there was no way for me to relate to those movies or those stories. And so 20 years later, we are still looking at a show that is so not diverse. We are still looking at a show that chooses to focus on upper caste, Hindu, pale-skinned people. So why was it so important to you to talk about Seema's world or to tell the story through her eyes?
First of all, thank you for sharing all of that. And, both for you and Meena, I hear everything you're saying and I respect everything that you're saying, all the observations that you made about the show. I think, just to answer your question directly, Christina, the reason that, why it was important for me to make the show about Seema, pretty simply is so I could smash the door open for you to make your show, or, whoever, for other people. So we have not had nearly enough South Asian representation in media. Like I grew up in the 90s where we were grateful to just have Apu on TV, just to see anything that represented our background. And not much has changed, in the 20 years since, as you pointed out. I think, I've examined, the South Asian experience, through independent documentaries. But I think what I've learned, in my experience is that, once something succeeds on a large scale, it can open the door, it can at least open the appetite, for more content, more representation. I knew there was never going to be a possibility for me to put everything, represent all of, the entire South Asian, the entire diasporic experience in one show. There was production limitations. There was, all kinds of reasons, why the show was ultimately made the way it was. But my hope is that now that the show is successful, one, that it starts some long overdue and very necessary conversations on a large scale, which I feel is happening. There's been a lot of articles written about the show, and the reason I very deliberately, engaged with the critiques of the show even more so than the praise of the show is because, I want the whole point of this, in its imperfect, messy way, was to facilitate the conversation, that we need to have around casteism, colorism, sexism, all of these things. So, the fact that that conversation is happening, the fact that there's, NDTV has a 3-hour special prime time, about examining marriage and examining all of these issues, the fact that there are families, that I've heard where, because multiple generations are watching the show, they're talking about the young people are, in conversation with their, elders and their parents about some of these ideals, I think that was the point. And I completely hear and respect the perspective that the show is very narrow and limited and also very, perpetuating, the same representation that we've seen over and over again, whether it be from Bollywood or, the same sort of idea about what Indian is, meaning North Indian, Hindu, upper caste, etc. But for me, I took the opportunity that was in front of me in hopes that I could open a door for more storytelling from people who have lived experience. I made the show from my lived experience, from a world that I had access to and understood, and try to expose within that, as much as I possibly could. But I hope that the success of the show will one, sort of open up the nonfiction market, the commercial nonfiction market, in India and in the diaspora, so that there are more storytellers can come and share their stories and their perspectives and more nuanced stories and things like that. But I think we had to start somewhere, and I had an opportunity and I took it, for that reason. And then in terms of all of the journalism and all the critique that's happened around the show, I 100% welcome and embrace it, and I've been engaging with it and sharing it, on social media because. The praise is the praise. The show is a hit, like people are watching it, but for me, with whatever sort of platform and voice I have, it's important for me to facilitate and create space for the deeper dialogue that needs to happen as a result of the show, including being here and speaking with you. And I'm here as much to listen and learn as I am to share, about my perspective and my experiences. So yeah, I think, the hope is that this is one season of one show, in a space, that is starved for representation. And I hope that it'll open the door for a lot more storytelling and that goes far beyond me, that where it can be more people with their lived experiences and their authentic stories can now have, an open ear, at a place like Netflix.
I'd like to ask Thenmozhi to kind of respond. You yourself are also a transmedia creator, and I think that you can give some kind of response as well. Hear your thoughts.
Yeah, JBeam, and good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I think the thing that I'm just really struck by is that, I've also been a woman of color in Hollywood, and I know how hard it is to produce content and get it through, particularly when you are dealing with executives that don't understand our context and are primarily white and have their own exotic, self-orientalized, versions about who we are, right? But I think at the same time, stories have a very deep power, and they reflect back to who we are as a people, and they also reflect the possibilities of what we can go to. And they also are grounded in a context. And I want to go back to a little bit of what Christina was saying, is that, there is no way to talk about love and romance and marriage in an Indian context without looking at the fact that our society is being ripped apart, is at the edge of genocide, primarily because we are in an unbridled moment of Brahmanism. And to me, what's so, it'd be kind of like having a series about white families talking about how great it was to practice love and segregation at the time that you had a court case like Loving versus Virginia, and the enormous laws against miscegenation. And we have miscegenation laws in India that come from Hindu scripture with the Code of Manu. And that really is the background of the purity and pollution that guides the whole framework of what is a suitable couple. I mean, you made a film called The Suitable Girl, so you know that context of a suitable boy. But as a Dalit person who reads that content or is exposed to it, it is a very violent reality where you are constantly in real life faced with the fact that you're never good enough, that the purity and what is a good family or a suitable match is never your family, and that if you do divides that are interfaith and intercaste, you are faced with impunity and violence and oftentimes like great pain. And in the diaspora, there are actually a lot of interfaith and intercaste couples, many of whom have actually fled India because they could not stay in India because of that. And a lot of the children that come from that experience feel very outcasted when they meet other members of the diaspora because of how casteist they are about, oh, well, you're not really this. You're not really an Indian because you don't go to temple. You're not really an Indian because you don't do this. And I think that like our duty as filmmakers and storytellers are not just to tell the world as it is now, but to tell the world of what could be, to create and make a way for the impossible through the unexpected and through the power of connection and hope. And I think that, the thing that strikes me about Netflix's programming in India is that it's very strategically focused on soothing the soapy desires of dominant caste people. And, and it's happening also, like this event is happening at the time that we got the announcement that Hassan Minhaj has been canceled, right? And the voices of caste oppressed and religious minority creatives are not given the same platform at a time when we're actually on the urgent front lines of changing the possibility for the subcontinent. Because again, this is not happening without a context of violence. We are at the edge of genocide. And the one thing I kept watching, like, I'd see the biodata photos, of everyone's resumes. And in community, like most of the people named the caste that they were looking for: Kshatriyas, Rajputs, Brahmins. And it was so casual for them. And, people have always told me that caste doesn't exist in the diaspora when they're from a dominant caste. But the area where it always comes out is marriage. That's why there's all these cruises for there's like a ready cruise where you can go to meet like ready suitors, right? Or there's like Brahmin socials where people will be trying to find and meet people. And so the vetting that happens in this space is so, it's actually core to like how we need to remove caste, because in many ways, like Dr. Ambedkar, the Dalit thinker and writer of the Indian Constitution, he talked about how caste and gender were linked because of endogamy. And that in order to remove caste, we had to really address at the core level how we build families, because families themselves are the most casteist institutions. And so I think in some ways, and we know this like very deeply, like in the Indian context, because there have been very, very painful honor killings of Dalits who have married dominant caste girls, and the dominant caste girl will be kidnapped back by her family. But meanwhile, the Dalit person in that couple will be, hashed alive, will be slashed alive. There's this one, Shankar and Kausalya, where there was literally CCTV of his body being chopped alive by thugs. And not only did the people who did it go free, but there was no resolution. And so that's the violent context that this is happening from. And I think that, when you look at arranged marriage, it doesn't really satisfy anybody. You know, it satisfies the need to be able to hoard wealth and to keep the families pure, but there is a diminishment of the humanity of people involved because they're not making choices that aren't, you know, choices of compromise. They're also denying the humanity of so many of the people that they don't want to see because of the purity piece. But also the system itself is at the core of the violence of the caste system. And that to tell a different story of how people brave the journeys to cross caste and to cross faith divides in a time that is so fraught with violence, which is, you know, the genocidal moment that we're in. That's the story I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear how hard it was for people to date and be afraid. And I think about like the Sikh character who, you know, was told over and over again about why she wasn't suitable. I mean, she was so beautiful. She looked, you know, she was competent. She was a great mother. And the fact that within the caste system and within the properness of suitability, she was like a bad match. You know, or even the character who was from a family where they were survivors of domestic violence and the shame he had to talk about, you know, that domestic violence. But that's actually also part of the patterns of violence in caste. And I think that's why, like, I feel like caste becomes this thing that where we don't talk about it, we carry so much violence and pain and enmity between each other that it's literally tanking the Indian democracy right now. And in many ways, I feel like we need stories that, you know, let's have soapy stories. I'm not saying that everything needs to be, you know, a dark documentary that is like intensely taking apart like the you know, the development of authoritarian states. But I think even in the ways that we tell stories of relationship and intimacy, there is a very fragile moment that many people are trying to traverse, which is, how am I authentic? How can I still find love? How can I build family in a time that is deeply insecure and that the person I love is not represented? And that if I love this person, I might lose my family. And I really want to bring up that case of Loving versus Virginia, because, you know, some of the first Indian Americans, when they would make cases to be citizens, they said that they, you know, and I'm thinking of Bhagat Singh Thind and A.K. Mozumdar, they would make cases that they deserved to be American citizens because they were brown white people, because they were upper caste. And Bhagat Singh Thind said very, you know, very succinctly that I know I would support miscegenation laws. Because I would never marry or be with someone who is a Mongolian, like, you know, Adivasi, you know, essentially, like I would never marry someone who's indigenous. So this is really a beast that we have to really confront in ourselves about what it is for us to love in the face of genocide. And how do we show up better as humans so that we stop dehumanizing ourselves? And that when corporations dictate this conversation, they're going to dictate to like who their like algorithm says is the most viable marketing group, right? But I think as storytellers, we can follow a different drumbeat that says, I want to tell the story of what we can aspire to. I want to speak to the pain that's here, but also move us to different possibilities. And I think that's where I think a lot of the critique and the pain from queer and Dalit and Muslim and Christian people was coming from, is that we will never be suitable under the caste system, but we are the right people to love if you want to be free.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go for a question that we've gotten from the Facebook group saying, asking it might have been better to explicitly mention to viewers before they watch that the show is supposed to start conversation. If that is the stand creators maintain, it becomes misleading and quite normative, a representation that can be taken at face value. And was there an opportunity or discussions, Smriti, for people to kind of give kind of a warning? I know that the process of making this was not an easy one for a number of reasons, but was there talk of contextualizing?
To be honest, there wasn't. The show was made, I think now that the show is sort of become this like global phenomenon, we're looking at it through the lens of a global phenomenon. It was the mandate when we made the show was to make it for an Indian and diasporic audience. You know, it was that was what the show was for. So it was always a balance. And look, I'm not saying I did this perfectly or did it right. And I'm learning a lot, as I speak to you, and you guys are, doing the incredible, labor of sharing all of, your experiences and your thoughts with me. But, it's all, when you're in the edit room, when you're making those decisions, it comes down to everything is a decision. And it's, for me, the choice was, I'm not making the show for a non-Indian gaze, for a Western gaze. So I'm not going to explain things, that Indians know inherently, or will be able to understand, without context. And similarly, it was a deliberate choice to not, would have been easy to edit out the 3 or 4 references to fairness. It would have been, possible to perhaps cast, a Muslim person or a caste oppressed person or someone like that. But the idea was to not sanitize or make the process or make this world seem more inclusive or progressive than it actually is. It is not inclusive. It's not progressive. It is extremely patriarchal. It is violent. It is all of those things. And I think, within the context of making a mainstream dating show, that was intended to, appeal to a wide audience, I tried to leave in, as much of the ugliness as I could. And also, the sort of the fun and the aspect of it, and leave it to the audience, again, with the intention that it was going to be an Indian and diasporic audience, South Asian and diasporic audience primarily, to see for themselves the limitations, of the system that we've created and we hold so tight to. The idea was to show the tension between someone like Seema, who holds on to, traditional regressive values sometimes, and some of her clients, who struggle with adopting that. And I think for me, it has been a journey, of deprogramming a lot of things that I've internalized over the years. I am not at the end of that journey yet. I don't think I'll ever be, and I think that's true for a lot of people. We come from a history of colonization. We come from a history of, violence and oppression, and, even amongst ourselves, patriarchy, all of that stuff. And I think it's going to take time, to unpack and deprogram ourselves of that. And, for all the critique of the show, the one thing that I do hope that it moves forward is this conversation, the very conversation, even if it comes through critique of the show, that is fine with me. I'm absolutely fine with the show being critiqued, and with very valid critique, if it moves this conversation forward, if it opens up, more eyes in people who have had the privilege to not engage with these conversations around caste, around patriarchy, around, colorism and all of that, who've had the privilege to be blind to it for their entire lives, including me. I have had the privilege of being blind to this for a huge part of my life. But if the show can push those conversations to the forefront in mainstream media, news, journalism, conversations like this, then at least maybe the next thing that comes out, whether it's the next season of the show or the next show that comes out, that is a soapy, mainstream show about the Indian or diasporic experience, can be more revolutionary than my show could have been. So
Meena, I'll let you respond. And then Christina.
I really do hear what you're saying, Smriti, and I understand you had the constraints and stuff. I think the show really did bring to the fore the sexist attitude, quite honestly. I mean, the way that the women were treated by Seema compared to the way that the men were treated, who were allowed to have their 150 choices, whereas the women were allowed to have 1 or 2 and had to be flexible. There was no way those women could just be them. going into whatever match that was going to be successful or not successful. So I think that highlighted that quite well. But, you know, the constant battle we have as campaigners on caste discrimination is that all we ever hear is there's no caste discrimination, especially amongst the diaspora. That's what we hear, because it's always the people that actually are doing the discriminating who say that, not the ones being discriminated against, and they never hear those people. And I think that the problem is everything is reduced to caste blindness, and people don't see it, or they just pretend they don't see it. And honestly, the non-Asian population, and this isn't just an Indian phenomenon, you know, we're talking in Nepal and Bangladesh and Pakistan and Sri Lanka, but the non-Asian population aren't going to have a clue if on that discrimination. We see this from the fact that the Cisco case basically says, well, we didn't see anything, and we haven't got any policy against it. And this has got to widen up that sort of conversation. We know, the converted, and know what is happening, so let's do something about it rather than keep burying it under the carpet. And I think this is a pivotal point now, both in the US, but also in the UK, where the diaspora population has been campaigning for years for legislation, which we got on the statute books, but now is being threatened with repeal. So what, are you just saying it just doesn't exist? Even after 13, 14, 15, 20 years of a Dalit population saying it does, just because you haven't experienced it. And I think there is something that we need now to do to take that forward. I mean, you know, Thenmozhi was talking about all the point in history we have within India, but for me as well, this is a point in history with the US diaspora, the UK diaspora, the diaspora across the world, because we're taking the caste discrimination with us wherever we are, and it's got to stop, really. And I think, you know, we need to come together to make sure that process starts to happen. Yeah, Christina, perhaps you can add.
Sure. No, what I wanted to say is, you know, you mentioned, Smriti, about how Netflix wanted to have a show for both the Indian and the Indian diaspora audience. What I wanted to highlight is that we are very much part of that audience too, right? We are viewing the show, we are consuming the show as well. And by we, I mean people who are Dalit, who are dark-skinned, who are Muslim, who are Christian, who are non-Hindu and non-upper caste, and non-all of those profiles that got, cast on the show, right? And so how is it that we can be okay with a show that is racist, that is sexist, that is casteist, and have this a very significant triggered population watch it, consume it, digest it, put up with terrible messages that are being exchanged between people, all for the sake of having a good woke conversation at the end of it. Right? I mean, I get what you're saying. I hear you when you say that this show has somehow opened the door for conversations, and that conversations are happening between families. But we've been talking about this for so long, as well, as Meena rightly pointed out, as Thenmozhi also was talking about. This is a conversation. I mean, caste is a 3,000-year-old system, and the kind of resistance and resilience that our people have been putting forward has been huge. And those of us who are active on social media are talking about it, writing about it. And so these conversations within families should already be happening. We don't need a racist, sexist, casteist show to trigger these conversations at the expense of people who are being humiliated in the course of it, right? So this is where I'm having trouble understanding how is it that this significant population is not being taken into account when a show such as this is being made, and this ugliness is being shown to all. I mean, won't we think twice, thrice before having a show that's terribly racist and terribly, as Thenmozhi mentioned, having white families talk about segregation and all of it, and still go with that show because we want to have woke conversations about racism within our families? Caste is such a huge, corrupt, inhuman system, and we are all victims of it. We are all being affected by it on an everyday basis. I mean, the reason why we are being so polite and we are sitting and having this conversation is that the rest of the time we are so angry and rage-filled and constantly in a place of being humiliated, because the kind of experiences that we are facing time and time again, regardless of whether we are part of the diaspora or in India, of course, those of us in India face a lot more, is just huge. And it happens on an everyday basis. We don't need another show to remind us of how horrible it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, I understand completely what you're saying, and I hear I hear your anger, and I understand, I validate everything that you're saying. I think it's I don't know how much a dating show can dismantle what you're talking about. Can it, I took this on, in hopes that it would start a conversation. So we, can be more aware, those of us who have been privileged enough to pretend that this violence doesn't exist, or it's, something that happens in the margins, or, this conversations about fairness and this and that are just innocuous. The hope was that now we can, and the patriarchy and the sexism and everything can be brought to light, so we can, people who have not been having those conversations, I completely understand that there have been a lot of people, who have been having those conversations, but people who have been able to shield themselves, from that and ignore that, and, and maybe in many cases, have been so insulated that they didn't even know that those conversations were happening, now have to confront those conversations. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Is it regressive? Is it hurting, more than it's helping? That's something that, is up to you to decide. I don't have the answer to that. I did the best I could within the scope that I had, and even in the aftermath of the show being released, in terms of trying to amplify these conversations and foster, facilitate these conversations. Believe me, nobody wants me to be here right now, in terms of, and having this conversation, with you all. But I think it's important, and I think it's important for me to also, as somebody in a position, of relative power and access, to also learn and acknowledge the limitations of my experience and my knowledge. I'm learning a lot sitting here and listening to you all. I really am, and I appreciate you for sharing all of that. And I hear your anger. I validate your anger, and I guess for me, what I hope will happen moving forward is that I'm not the only, or one of the only few people, who are given opportunities to make shows like this, because I'm going to make stuff that, comes from my narrow experience, my limited, relatively privileged experience. And, of course, I'm going to continue to push to be better and do better and create better. But there should be a lot more people. There should be a lot more people who are telling our stories, not just me, not just Mindy, not just Padma Lakshmi, not just, 4 or 5 of us, should have these opportunities. The last thing I want to do is be another gatekeeper. The last thing I want to do is be another gatekeeper. I want to be a facilitator, and I guess for this show, in my messy, imperfect way, that was the hope, is to be a facilitator, make something on a scale that would get noticed and recognized, and prove that there's a market, there's an audience, there's reaction, there's nuance, there's nuance. There is a diaspora that's not just, like one thing. And then hopefully open the door for more conversations, more content, and more perspectives. So, yeah.
No, I think we have a bunch of questions that are coming in, and I want to acknowledge that we're going to get to those. I think one of the questions that I wanted to come back to, some things that Thenmozhi was saying in her response, and ask that in this light of Indian matchmaking and kind of so many of these things coming to the fore in such a time that's so fraught for the diaspora and for the Indian community in general, what are some of the ways that we can, in your view as an organizer, how then do we talk about these issues? How do we use these kinds of platforms to push things forward rather than kind of get, for lack of a better word, stuck in the critique? What can we do?
So I think what's really important is that there's actually a lot of great models that already exist in Hollywood. And I think we can look at the work of Ava DuVernay, Oscar So White, and even like, the storytelling of, filmmakers like Ryan Coogler, who was my classmate when I was at USC. And I think that, what I've seen in like seeing and working and building with other creators of color is that I think we have to trick the devil here, and we don't have to accept the limitations of power, particularly when power wants us to tell the story that lets it extend its power, and that we have to be able to use a radical imaginary to be able to open up more possibilities. And some of it is punching up. And for me, I think the reasons why we see the continual lifting up of dominant caste creators over other creators that come from more diverse backgrounds is because there is a myth that's told that, caste oppressed stories don't tell. Caste oppressed creators aren't viable. But we actually are the next billion users of the internet. If you really want to capture the future of the Indian market, you want to tell stories that center those of us that have been in the margins. And you want to have those people at the table with equity. And I bring that up because what Christina was speaking to is like really important, is that it's not that when we're not having these conversations that we're just angry, but that actually to even speak up as a Dalit woman or as a Dalit creator, you're not having the same experience as people who are Brahmin and creating. Every single time each of us opens our mouth, we are faced with rape threats, we are faced with death threats, and we are faced with a constant attempt to deplatform us from our ability to speak truth to power, or even speak hope to power. And myself as a filmmaker, I actually put down my camera because I've got so many rape and death threats, and there was so little protection that myself and my team had. I just couldn't deal with it anymore. And I wanted to think about creating in a different way that didn't have such violent stakes for me and my family. And I always think about that because while I'm creating and still making art, I was pushed out of an industry because there was no protection for a creator that was a Dalit filmmaker. And I think that's what I'm saying, is that I feel like, I understand everything that you're talking about. The challenge is like when you're in the edit room and you have to think about how do you create like an achievable arc and the stories that you have to tell. And it's not one filmmaker was responsible for a casteist white supremacist industry, right? And I also faced, growing up in the diaspora, I always think it's funny. I was telling my friend this. Me and my sister used to reenact that scene in Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom, where Molaram is like taking the heart out of the guy chained to the thing, mostly because that was the first time we saw Indians in a movie with Harrison Ford. And so we would react those scenes because it was the only thing that we saw in English that had us. And it was horribly racist, horribly casteist, right? But we were so hungry to be seen, and we were so hungry for stories. And I think that, what I would like to see out of this is, first, for all of the producers and venture capitalists and people that are financing, that are watching this, you are actually doing shitty business by not centering more diverse storytellers and more diverse options at this time. And also to think about this moment very similar to the Depression, where you have huge generational challenges. Like for us, we're dealing with climate change, a pandemic. In India, we're dealing with the genocide. In the US, we have Trump. And we can tell stories in the same ways that we have because that's the safe thing. But what people did during the Depression is they told stories of hope and possibility and different paths to power. And I feel like that's actually what we need right now. Like I feel like when I talk to people who I know who are dominant caste, who watch that show, they don't have the same reflection that you're having about it. They actually don't think that, they're not even having a woke conversation. They're like, oh my God, that's so right. Look at my auntie doing X, Y, and Z. Even Aparna, the character that's in Texas, Texas has a Democratic candidate who is a Hindu nationalist that's running for office. People don't see that contradiction because they don't see their own biases. And I feel like oftentimes our discussions of caste are waiting on the discomfort and the learning curve of dominant caste people. And that's too slow of a freedom time curve for us. Because while we're waiting for that discomfort to fall away, while we're waiting for people to be able to, like, you know, will it be this cognitive workshop that people go that will change? Every day we are seeing 3 Dalits murdered, 2 that are raped, 2 houses that are burned every day. And I would ask any person if that's an acceptable statistic for you to wait for the people who are oppressing you to feel comfortable for this conversation, as opposed to us saying, fuck that, we're going to seize the ring of power and we don't want to be like this. And I say this as someone in the diaspora because I have seen the most ludicrous things that people in the United States say about caste, to deny it, to shove it under the rugs. And yet in the United States, in California, you know, you have had ready landlords who trafficked young Dalit girls and made them their sex slaves. You have seen widespread Dalits speak to caste discrimination on the assembly line and in the C-suite. We are seeing verbal and physical assault here simply because dominant caste people can't see their own biases. And I would argue it's not that they're seeing caste, it's that they are experiencing the benefits of caste. And so they have no reason to want to speak to it. But guess what? In 2020, this is not the reality. People who are oppressed are speaking out and coming forward in whatever way that they can. And I feel like as creators and storytellers, what we should do is band together and say, we want something different. We want something that is liberatory. And again, like, I understand, like, the genre of this is not like, you know, we're not going to tell like Russian style documentaries of the rise of authoritarianism. I get that. But even within the soapy, I think that there's a lot that we could share. Like, for example, it would be really powerful to see in the diaspora, you know, a Dalit and trans couple try to find their way and communicate. How do you share with your family, you know, the fact that you're with a trans man? Or I think people would love to see, like, you know, a lot of people have expressed to us that like 40% of Dalits in the United States face, you know, rejection and romantic partnerships once they tell the dominant caste family's members that they're Dalit. I would love to see a couple that like traverses an intercaste and interfaith possibility, you know, and not to say that all of those relationships end happily. A lot of them don't, because it's so hard to buck a structural system in your family, which is one of the hardest pieces. Seeing that possibility actually opens it up and paves the way for more of it in our material reality. And I guess that, you know, for producers that are watching, for venture capitalists that are watching, telling these diverse stories is actually better business than keeping the status quo. Because honestly, if your platform doesn't speak to caste oppressed people, we're going to go somewhere else. And think about the fact that in just India alone, we are close to 280 million people. That is larger than, you know, that's like 3/4 of the American population. Why would you throw away all of those users? And why would you throw away this moment to lead a cultural conversation? And so I just think that there's a lot of things that we're not always being the most strategic about, and that in many ways I feel like it's a really great time for you know, creators to come together and strategize, and then not let them divide us, like in terms of the producing room. Really lift up each other whenever we can be lifted up, and also not assume the assumption that telling Brahmin stories is the only way to go. Because, you know, if you think about this moment in terms of South Asian, you know, representation, we have Mindy Kaling's show, we have, you know, this series, and then we have the BBC show, you know, retelling of A Suitable Boy, right? And in each of these, there's such an erasure of so much of the diversity of the diaspora. Particularly when I'm thinking of Mindy Kaling's show, so many people were triggered by this show, you know, and, you know, particularly because there's such a celebration of Tam Brown culture, and Christina and I are Tamil. There was a reason why Tamil Brahmins faced a movement in Tamil Nadu to be kicked out because of the centuries of violence. So could you imagine like a plantation show where people are like, yes, I'm so excited to be like a plantation descendant? That would not be a thing. But, you know, these conversations become more than entertainment, particularly in this year, because we have a Brahmin senator who is now the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. And in so many of Kamala Harris's biographies, they talk about her being a Tambram and her Tambram family and like her Tambram grandfather, and that every time she ran an election, she would call her aunt or her chitti and say, break 108 coconuts for me, chitti. And I remember talking to my dad, who's livid that we have like a Brahmin candidate right now. And he said, I was like, Dad, what do you think about this? And he's like, he's casteist. This is absolutely casteist. And I was like, why do you think it's casteist? He's like, do you think a Dalit can call the priest to break coconuts? Well, they would actually break our heads for even going into the temple. But why is someone who's running on a platform for justice talking about a casteist practice to get her in the office? And also that she's senator of a state during the time when the most historic case against caste discrimination has been brought forward, and she's not said a single word. And it makes no sense because she had no problem wiping the decks with, you know, Biden about his position on busing. Well, as a Dalit who grew up in California, who grew up under cities that she was the AG for, where I was in the streets around her position around police brutality, I want her to do better. Because it's not about representation anymore. We actually need to be able to pivot people into positions where they're actually holding our issues close. Because I don't want an Indian in office if they're not going to speak to the issues that matter to me, like immigration and caste discrimination and racial, and policing and violence. And yet, I think it's a very Brahmin position politically to go into a place of power, to just simply get into power and then never do anything with that key of power. And I guess that this is where the power of audiences as movements really have an ability to pivot this moment into a more collaborative understanding of the stories we need to get out of this moment that we have.
And Thenmozhi, I think you hit on something so critically important, not just I think for the Indian community, I think, but for all
Absolutely.
POC communities. I mean, I'm Iranian myself. We also have our own issues around arranged marriage. We also have major issues around our anti-Blackness stance and positions that are hugely detrimental to our communities, both within the country and outside. And I think that you're posing a question that's really critical, because part of that is some of what's happening right now, which is us having the opportunity to speak to Smriti and her being open enough to hear it and be held accountable for what we see as shortcomings. But what I think is also really critical for us to do, obviously we won't solve it in this conversation, but to really say, how can we as women of color hold our communities accountable while holding ourselves accountable too, towards our positions of anti-Blackness, towards our positions of lack of inclusivity amongst the diversity of our voices and our own communities, and those are things I think that we really, all of us have to reckon with, and the kind of the place and the time that we're at. And I know Meena's been a little bit quiet, so I want her to give her a chance to say a few comments as well and respond, but I also want to turn to some of the myriad of questions that we're getting in. But I want to really pinpoint that what you're talking about in reference to Kamala Harris's, candidacy, that's really a critical point, that she may be a woman of color, but she's a woman of color that comes from a certain type of privilege, and she's in a unique position to play both sides of that in this country. And how in that realm do we hold one another accountable? And I think that's something for us all to think about. Meena, I'll let you.
No, I mean, no, it's just, listening to everyone is actually equally interesting to me, rather than just the talking. But I think, we are in a very critical period, and hearing what you just said about Kamala Harris, Thenmozhi, it was like, I think sometimes when you're not in there, you don't sometimes think of those questions. For me, the telling one has always been, I think I saw a tweet about about Kamala Harris's mother having brought up Kamala and Maya in the African American community rather than the Indian American community. And I was like, I wonder why that is. And I mean, I know why that is because the Indian American community would have rejected them because he was Black. And that whole thing about anti-Blackness and colorism, actually is something that, we as Indians, we hear it all the time. I mean, that whole thing around colorism, the fair and lovely issue. And I think with Kamala Harris, yeah, you're absolutely right. Why hasn't she? Why hasn't she said anything about the case in California? I mean, unbelievable. I mean, it just didn't occur to me that, that she hadn't, or something, some sort of statement. And this is what I'm saying, whether it be in the US or in the UK, is just constantly brushed under the carpet. We just don't hear, and all you ever hear is caste discrimination doesn't exist, as opposed to here it is, it's happening. What are we going to do about it? We need to address it. I mean, and every time we say about caste in the UK, we're still saying, look, one case of caste discrimination is enough to say that it exists. You know, and we have legislation. Why aren't we implementing that legislation? What is it that is holding people back from having a legislation that will protect someone's human rights? It is beyond my ken that this is an issue when we've got it there. It was agreed by Parliament, and yet we're still at a situation where we're trying to keep people happy, and we know which side is being kept happy. It's not Dalits. You know, we're not trying to keep Dalits happy. We're trying to keep the other side happy, the anti-legislation side, the one that is worried that the caste is associated with Hinduism, so therefore we don't want our reputation risk. The fact that the whole hate speech dialogue and discussion is being turned around. So it's not about the hate speech that, you know, we get on social media, that Dalits get, you know, the caste hate speech, etc. It's now suddenly the Hindus are accusing us all of hate speech against them because we're trying to introduce caste discrimination legislation, and it's anti-Hindu, and it's just, I don't know, it is, like I said, it's beyond me that this can continue to be something that is allowed to be hidden, and we call it hidden apartheid for a reason. So, you know, it's just, I mean, I would be interested, Madhis, to hear some of the comments on Facebook, because I think, you know, obviously we do have quite a wide audience out there, and I'm not sure how many, you know, if we know how many are watching, but yeah, I mean, I think, you know, me and Christina and Thenmozhi do, I mean, the rage shows and the commitment to this cause, it is a cause for me, and it just makes me so angry that we're here in the 2020s and we've got this issue still happening, and ignored.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna open up to some of the questions that are coming in, and I encourage people to kind of submit their questions now. But one of the questions, and it brings us back to the show actually, Smriti, is to tell us a little bit more about the caste composition of the people who worked on producing the show. And I think that's actually a very interesting question for many. So,
yeah, the show was commissioned by a South Asian executive at Netflix. On the actual producing team, there was 4 of us on the executive producer level, sort of key decision maker, creative level. I was the only South Asian one on that level. Our actual crew, shooting crew, was, you know, more diverse. You know, there were, we had, of course, our team in India, you know, we're all, we had an Indian field producer and, you know, all Indian crew in India, of course. In the US, you know, we had a more diverse crew, but not many. I don't think we had any South Asian people on the crew. You know, and that's something hopefully that will change in the future.
and I know for you, whether it's right to bring up or not too, but you also had major life events while you were in the process of doing this. And
yeah, I gave birth to my son on our first day of production. So yeah, that was, and yeah,
I can't imagine the challenge. I can't imagine the challenge.
On the road 2 weeks later.
That's quite a bit. There's also a question, again, for you, Smriti, is like, did the story spring from a personal story? And if so, then this was not the baby you just had.
No, how are you? Can you say hi, Isabel?
Hi.
Hi.
You wait for me.
And if so, if this came from a personal story and the interrogation of your own experience and how you have or haven't confronted patriarchy in this arranged marriage construct, that may have been an important discussion about your framing. I'm not sure that's a thing. I'm not sure where the question was.
Yeah.
There.
Do they mean
I guess it's more about if you talked a little bit more about your own experience. And whether it came from a personal experience and whether you examined that experience.
I mean, it was from my perspective. I wouldn't say it was entirely from my personal experience. I mean, you know, there are many people on the show and they have different experiences. You know, I don't necessarily know that it wasn't, you know, this wasn't like an author documentary, you know, it wasn't like not Michael Moore, you know, so I'm not on screen talking about these things. So, you know, the idea was just to examine these things through the specific stories of the participants on the show. You know, but yes, certainly like in the sort of promotion of the show and in doing interviews and talking to people about the show, you know, I tried to make it clear, baby, you gotta be quiet, go sit over there. Try to make it clear, you know, the perspective that I'm coming from, you know, the narrow and quite privileged perspective that I'm coming from, you know, and also like many of the participants on the show, the world of the show, you know, I think that's, it is very narrow, and I've never purported to speak for, you know, an entire population or an entire diaspora. You know, it's impossible to do that. Yeah, I mean, I think the context is important of who's telling the story. And it's also important to know whose story is not being told, which is, I think, what we're talking about here today.
Yeah. There's a question from Ria Modak that's saying she'd like to, Meena, Christina, and Thenmozhi would love to hear your thoughts on the face reading scene and how it perpetuates Orientalist exotic notions of India while also hiding the casteism of these traditions.
I'm going to hand that one over to Christina for the moment.
Well, I don't know what to say to that, to be honest. I've never been through that kind of an experience, probably because I come from a Christian sort of an upbringing. So I don't know. I guess I would probably bucket it under one of those regressive practices that a lot of families still have to go through, whether it's face reading or astrology. I think she also consults with an astrologer where he talks about how they would be compatible, including in bed. And well, I mean, all that I can say is that it just depends on what you believe in. And some people tend to use that as an excuse to say that someone is not compatible with me, and that could potentially have casteist underpinnings too. In all, I think for me individually, I'm not able to respond much to it because I haven't been through that experience myself.
And I think the same thing. I mean, I was kind of, I know it happens. I mean, you know, I think everyone can tell from my accent. I mean, I'm UK based, and I've never had any of that face reading, astrology, palm reading, any of those things happening. And I don't know. I mean, I think I was wondering at the time, you know, because I started out with my criticism of, you know, privileged and oh so fair. I'm wondering, you know, and fairness doesn't necessarily denote a caste of anything. It just perpetuates the notion of casteness. And I think, you know, if you had a fair Dalit girl whose face was being read, I don't know whether what that would do, whether she'd be rejected because he'd be able to read her face and say she was a Dalit. I don't know. It's an interesting exercise, and one I do find very archaic.
I was just going to say, I think there's a way to look at this also that's a little bit more complex. Like, I think that, for example, you know, in Tamil Nadu, there was a movement led by a leader named Periyar that was called the self-respect movement that very much, you know, said that in order for us to be free of caste, we have to let go of superstitious practices like this. So you don't practice, you know, astrology, and you don't practice, you know, these kinds of face reading skills, because they actually almost always lead to violence against caste oppressed people, because we will always be on the bottom of these kind of like magical sciences. And it really brings to mind to me like that whole study in the early 1900s of criminal anthropology, where there was a phrenology where people would study a face to see if there was a way to show physical traits of what would make someone a criminal versus like what would make someone like more apt to be a person in society. And you know, magically, of course, like the people who were coming up with that science were white, and they privileged, you know, white features over African and indigenous features, right? And so for me, like when I saw that scene, it just reminded me how fraught it is when we go into, you know, some of the mystical traditions, whether it's Ayurveda or the astrology or these other pieces, and why Dalits have actually left those practices behind because we couldn't afford the violence that was accorded to us. And even with like Vedic astrology, like, you know, there's this idea of someone being a manglik, where because of the stars, you're like unmarriageable. And so what people will do is like they will marry you to a goat or to a tree so that you get your bad marriage juju so that you can then marry, you know, nicely. And, you know, actresses like Aishwarya Rai had this thing, right, where she famously married a tree before she married her partner. But I think that like those aren't the things like in a just society where everyone gets to choose who they love and that they get to experiment and fail in love. You know, you're not going to go to some like old uncle that is using some archaic, you know, discriminatory practice to tell you if you're going to be good in bed. Ideally, you're going to be able to be sexually empowered enough to try and get a sense of your own pleasure and then find your relationships. But that's not an opportunity that's available to you within the world of arranged marriage and the spiritual advisors to it. So I think that to me was just another example of the casteist kind of framework of this space. But also ideally, if people are looking at it, they can consider like, why did my mom make me do that Vedic astrology thing? Maybe I don't need that. Maybe I just need to have therapy and the ability to like have like my friends who help me go out and date with equity. You know, that could just be like the way to go. You know, do you want an uncle in a dark room looking at a photograph of you and telling you when you're ready for marriage? Absolutely not. You know, what if you're polyamorous? You know what I mean?
There's, I have I guess a two-pronged question, one of which is a bit of my own. One is the Guyanese Nadia is so popular, I think, and so many people look at her as like, hey, she should have no problems without having to go through the arranged marriage process and things. And yet she, in many ways, in terms of her commitment to culture, was so much more Indian than so many of the women that were profiled by kind of her interests and things. Yet she constantly was aware of her Indo-Caribbean background and how that was a detriment to her. And was that in part because her caste is not traceable, because her family's history has so long been outside of India? Is that part of it, is one of the questions? And the second one is the money question that I think everybody asks. Why, how much does Seema Aunty get? How much does she charge? And I guess my question to that on top of it is dowry legal in India? And is that part of the reason why maybe it wasn't included?
I mean, I'll speak to, I can't speak to Seema's fees, you know, that's for her to say. I can tell you, I know there's like a lot of rumors flying around about what she charges. I don't know where those are coming from or if they're necessarily true. In terms of dowry being legal, it's technically not legal, you know, but we all know that technically not legal is not the same as it doesn't happen. You know, it's not something, it does happen. It happens very much. It happens, you know, like implicitly all the time. It's not the reason that her fees weren't, I mean, disclosed or anything like that. That's not the reason, you know, why we just didn't disclose her fees, because her fees are always changing and they vary, you know, depending on who she's working with, because she takes a lot of, you know, it's a business for her, but it's also, you know, it's like a sort of homemade, you know, kind of situation. So she'll take clients, you know, some will pay, some won't pay, you know, it'll just, it's sort of loose like that. And the question about Nadia, I don't know enough to be able to speak to why, you know, with authority in terms of why she, you know, was sort of rejected or struggled, you know, to be seen as Indian, or why she, you know, presents herself a certain way. But it feels like there's something there, you know, it feels like there's something there, that something there about her identity that she, within the sort of, you know, diasporic experience, that she struggled with. And I thought that was interesting, you know, I thought that's sort of an aspect, you know, that was one way to sort of break from, you know, a little bit from like the very, you know, like Indian immigrant, you know, like come straight, you know, like our parents came here as immigrants, you know, type of narrative, that there are other experiences, you know, within the diaspora. But I don't think I can speak with authority in terms of her intention, you know, or the intention of her previous relationships in terms of why they didn't work out.
I think Thenmozhi maybe has a couple of comments on it, and I want to acknowledge the time and say that we're going to wrap this up briefly. So I wanted to give Thenmozhi, if you can kind of give us a little bit of what you might see as the history of Nadia's trials and tribulations.
So I think, you know, not knowing Nadia, but knowing a lot of the caste history of the indentured community, a lot of indentured women face a lot of relationship struggles more than indentured men because of Brahminical patriarchy. Because, you know, the woman is really how caste purity is kept. And so if you know, most people who were indentured are actually Bahujin, you know, because there was that old prohibition when you crossed the water, which was the black water or the Kalapani, you would lose caste. So many people who were forced into indentured came from the lower castes already. And in California, there's a group of, you know, Chamar families who were Ravadasya, who were indentured, and they immigrated into California. And the thing that was so interesting, which, you know, really mirrors Nadia's experience, is that the men of those families had no problem marrying, you know, dominant caste girls, but the girls staggered for grooms because people thought they were impure, or they weren't, you know, it wasn't just that they weren't Indian enough, it's that they weren't, it wasn't that they were casteless, they were actually casted because of being in that frame of the indenture. And I think that, you know, there's a lot to be said about seeing how caste travels, especially for twice migrated people, like those that are Indo-Fijian and Indo-Caribbean. But in all of that, I felt like, you know, what I thought was so poignant about her story was that something was happening to her. She didn't have enough language or context to understand, and she kept trying to find love. And, you know, some of how the people were treating her had nothing to do with her. It had to do with their own caste biases and their own religious biases. And that was so painful and poignant to see, because she looked, you know, she was an amazing woman. You know, she had like such a great spirit, and there was things she kept trying, and she kept hitting a wall. And I feel like that it's that miseducation that if we actually had greater conversations in the diaspora, we'd actually have much less harm between ourselves, but also more possibility. And so I was just really struck by her story, because I don't think she knew that history, and I don't think she knew that she wasn't alone in facing that rejection, and that it wasn't about her not being Indian enough. It's that she wasn't caste privileged enough, which is a really different equation, you know?
Even though in the US, she seemed to be economically privileged. In that,
yeah, but that's not the equation here. What is suitable here is that you are continuing your caste purity lines. That's why so many of the community data points were like, I'm looking for another Rajput, I'm looking for another Kshatriya, I'm looking for another Brahmin. And when the biodata images came up, you could see that in the community questions. So Seema doesn't ask caste preferences, she's asking community questions. So when you look at that, you see that right away, that this is the viewpoint that they're looking at.
I was also fascinated by her when she was showing, when you showed her entering a room, and how she would introduce people so much with their first and their last name, when she was just Seema from Mumbai. And it was pointed out to me that part of that is also kind of to give an implicit information in terms of the caste and like the background that they come from. You know, is that accurate as well, or in terms of how it happens?
I'm not sure that Seema from Mumbai would necessarily.
No, not that she would. She never introduced herself that way, I should say. She didn't introduce her first and her last name, but when she was introducing other people, she seems often to say their first and their last name.
Absolutely. No, I think, you know, within those, you know, everyone will know, just based on your name. And I think, you know, that designates your caste. And if it doesn't, then people ask you enough questions to find out what it's going to be. I mean, literally, they will delve down. So I will always have that question. It's like, where are you from? And I don't know if everyone's seen, even on a little Twitter video, it's like, no, where are you really from? Because I'll always say, oh, I'm from the UK. And then I'll say, well, I'm from London. And then I'll say, I'm from South London. And then they'll go on and on until they have dug deep enough to be able to work out exactly where you're from, which town, which village, which area, which state in India. You know, and that's what people want to know, because then they can unravel your caste from that. And it really does play a massive part in everything. And marriage is just the ultimate. I mean, I think, you know, even in social sphere, in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, everything is touched by caste.
As often, I think women also, as you're pointing out, bear the brunt. There's a question that says, why is it that women were told to adjust? And that was normalized in the show, and people asking for matches in their community was normalized in the show. The marrying within communities, how the separation of caste comes from in villages, and intercaste couples are killed in village, and this is normalization of marrying within the community. I would add on to that kind of just to link it back to that, but in a more superficial way too, is that Rupam she's a physician, no? And that wasn't really addressed. And then when it was such a big deal, and then when she entered to show her family in New York and all this pressure that was putting on her, what would be suitable and how she had to tone it down, you went in and you said, wait a minute, your sister's a revolutionary who's bucked the system, and she has a beautiful interracial family. Which I took the point, but it was really interesting, but kind of why it is that women were constantly told to adjust.
Because women are constantly told to adjust, whether it's explicit or implicit, constantly told to adjust. And that's the reality of the role of women, or the expected role of women within, Indian patriarchal structures. It's the reality of the role of women everywhere, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you live in the West, whether you live in the East, whether you're, not Indian in, professional setting, within your family structure. Once you're married, women are constantly expected to adjust. And I think for Seema, a lot of this stuff comes out as a fact, and her biases get revealed, as opposed to her being explicitly, stating them. The fact that she did tell Vyasar also he needs to adjust, the man, but it happens a lot more with women, and that reveals a bias, that exists in our society, that women are told to adjust constantly. And if things are not working out in terms of finding life partners for women, the diagnosis is always, well, you need to adjust more. I think, what we tried to show is the counterpoint to that, which is women rejecting, that notion. Specifically someone like Ankita, even Rupam, like for all the matter of fact, things that Seema had to say about her, in terms of her, it was going to be difficult for her to find somebody. One, this is like, I think this comes back to the what you brought up earlier, Matis, with the Fair and Lovely. If we just take the name off of it, does it change anything? Actually, the product is still the same. The implicit, intention of the product is still the same. Just because we call it now Glow and Lovely, does that actually change anything? Or does it just make us feel better about it? And it was the same thing with Rupam. I mean, Seema said to her face, it's not like she said something behind her back. She said to her face, you were divorced with a child, it's going to be harder for you. It's going to be harder for me to find somebody for you. Do we think that doesn't exist in Western culture? Do we think it's like not harder, for single mothers in Western culture to find companionship and life partners? Of course it's hard. We just don't say it, we just don't say it as explicitly. And maybe, it's harder in Indian, of course it's harder, there's an added layer of, stigma in Indian patriarchal culture. But I think, we can't dismantle things if we're not willing to name them, and I think that's what we're doing here today, and I think a lot of that is what, I tried to do in the show, is just rather than like making everything seem nice and seem progressive and seem inclusive, I'd rather, in whatever messy way, name the problems, put a name to it so we can talk about it and examine it, in the light of day. And in regards to, Rupam's brother-in-law and his appearance on the show and why it wasn't made a bigger deal of, honestly, I think people think we have a lot more control in documentary and reality TV than we do. He didn't want to be a part of the show. Her sister didn't want him and the children to be a part of the show for their own personal reasons. it was a last minute decision when we had an hour left to shoot, maybe less, when they decided to show up. And so we filmed with them, and that was it. There was really nothing more to it, you know, or there was no more intention behind it than that. It was just a practical thing. And, you know, we thought, at least subtly, we used that footage because we thought subtly it was important to at least show, you know, like show the hypocrisy, right? Like there's, you know, that on one hand, you know, you're sort of drilled, you know, into this idea that, you know, what you should marry within your community, you should marry within your community, or there's like a stigma around, you know, even though Rupam herself, you know, was divorced and, you know, has a child, somebody else who is divorced and has a child is judged, you know, like I think there's a lot of inconsistency and a lot of hypocrisy within the way we think. And that was a subtle way, you know, to demonstrate that. And again, this is not to cast judgment or to shame anybody, because we're all a product of our upbringing, a product of our environments. We cannot see what we cannot see, you know, but once it's in a TV show and everyone's talking about it, maybe now we can see more, you know, and we can evolve out of some of these ideas.
I want to acknowledge the time and that we're running out of it, and actually have 26 minutes ago run out of it. So I appreciate everybody staying on for longer. Just in terms of last question, I want to hear your final thoughts on these things. And I think very specifically, I would say what we would like, if they're hoping that you get a season 2 and that it can encompass and include some of the comments and visions and things that are here too. I think I would love to hear from the panelists what you would like to see as shows like this inevitably get a season 2. And one is how much sway you think you might have, Smriti, over season 2, how much influence you may really have in terms of the casting and the way it's executed, and hoping that you do have a lot more say over that, what we can as panelists might want to see from that, and what you would like to see from it too, Smriti. So I'll let the panelists go first, and then and end with Smriti, if I may. So Christina.
Sure. So what I want to reiterate is that arranged marriage is the vehicle that caste endogamy takes. And I think it's an absolute truth that we need to acknowledge, we need to understand. And like mentioned earlier, caste is a huge problem that those of us, you know, 260 million of us and more, 280 million of us and more in India, as well as in the diaspora, are struggling with, are dealing with, are being challenged with on an everyday basis. We don't need a show such as this to keep reminding us of what we are facing, to keep triggering us, where we are constantly being told that you're not good looking, or you're not good enough, you're not attractive enough. My article about, you know, swipe me left, I'm Dalit, was very much about what it means to be Dalit and woman, and to go through this process of finding love, of finding your partner. Of course, I'm very happily married now to a fellow Dalit man, but the process that I went through was horrible for me. And I wouldn't wish that on any of my Dalit sisters, but unfortunately it keeps happening. So with this understanding in mind, I'm not sure about a season 2, but my call would be for not just shows like Indian Matchmaking, but for all kinds of show that are India focused, to really take into account those of us who you don't think of when you're strategizing and when you're planning, you know, what shows will be a hit. That we are also part of that population who's going to consume it. And it is of great importance to keep us in mind when you are making these shows. I think that's where I would leave it. Yeah.
Meena?
I don't have much to add to what Christina just said. I mean, she just put it so well and so articulately. And I don't think actually it's just bearing what Christina is saying about bearing us in mind. Actually, it's not about bearing in mind. It's involving. It's talking to. It's having the strategizing moment with those that are constantly excluded and made more excluded by such programs. And I think that for me, that inclusion is the one that starts to begin to address, whether it be within programs such as this, whether it be in films, whether it be in the corporate boardroom, whether it be in corporations full stop. I think we've got to start turning this on its head, because every time we turn around and say it's something doesn't exist and we are caste blind, then it just perpetuates the system. And we need to become much more aware and actually talk to those who are being discriminated against most.
Thenmozhi.
Yeah, I think that there's actually a lot of hope in, I think, this conversation, because if you even think about being able to have a conversation like this even 5 years ago, it would never happen. Bollywood itself is such a casteist industry, and very rarely do caste oppressed people get to talk about the stories we want, the kinds of production processes we want. So I feel like this is really a huge step forward, and I really appreciate Smriti and Nidhi for you creating this opportunity for us to brainstorm together. And one thing I was thinking about, because obviously we want more Desi creators and we want more diverse Desi creators. So if there is a second season, one thing I thought could be really interesting would be to open it up from the lens of arranged marriage and just look at love Desi style, because there's just enough storytelling in that could actually hit all the soapy points that I think draw people to this story, but then don't get stuck on some of the angles that are so painful related to caste endogamy. I remember, growing up in California and dating and feeling utterly horrified. The guy, there was a guy who was really wanted to come and tell me that he liked me when I was an undergrad. And I didn't even let my friend finish the conversation. I just ran from one part of the campus to the other because I was mortified and so shy, and also didn't have a model of someone who looked like me, who was Dalit and South Asian, who could talk about, sexual experiences, could feel empowered about the tenderness that you feel about when you're trying to approach love. And also because I was so afraid, I was really afraid of ever interacting with anyone who was Indian American that was dominant caste, because I was afraid that I might have a love connection with them, but that they would hurt my family or they would hurt me. And so I just it was just such a place of fraughtness because there wasn't imagery around it. And I think that being able to look at some of the diversity that's missing here could actually be added into a second season if we take out the lens of arranged marriage and just look at the topic of love in the diaspora, and love across all of these different divides of class and language and faith and caste, and see how people are trying to find a way where there hasn't been a way, and in a context that makes it so fraught. So I would love to see that. And I think also, to just pick up on another point that Christina was saying, is that, this is actually a manufactured problem. The fact that there's such a lack of diversity across stories from creators of color, and even within South Asian stories that we only see dominant caste creators, it's a manufactured problem with producers that actually have a lack of imagination of what would sell in this market. And again, I just want to tell people there who finance projects, it is bad business to ignore 200 to 300 million people. It's just bad business, particularly because our communities are new to the internet and will actually be longer consumers when we see ourselves reflected. And guess what? When we see ourselves reflected, we don't want to be seen through stereotypes. We want to see fully realizations that we're complex and grappling with our moments, and also find hope and possibility. So I think that it's really important for creatives that are listening to not accept the terms that are being given to us by producers and finance people, and to find ways to trick the devil together, which means I don't think it's responsible for one filmmaker or one producer to change a casteist and white supremacist systems. I think we have to be crafty and utilize audience power and collective understandings of where we want to push stories to go, and then hold the line together. And we know that in Hollywood, people have banded together in different moments like this, whether it was around the targeting of, creatives during the Red Scare, where people were brought in front of hearings for being linked to communism, or in other moments where, I remember talking to this really amazing Black organizer in Hollywood, S. Pearl, and she talked about how Black actors and producers would organize around the tremendous racism, and that people that were that were Black actors who would be playing maids during the day would actually host the opening of plays written by Black playwrights in their garages, and create audiences where people didn't believe that there should be audiences. And I just think we accept a lot in order to be able to have representation, but I think we deserve more. And we deserve to be able to ask for everything in the ring of power right now, and to also ask for the world to be a different place. And stories are the first place for that. And that's why I really, I really want to thank like the candidness of this conversation. And also, like, Smriti, I really hear you about saying, like, I did this so that there could be others that follow me. I did this. And also there's a case for observational documentary where it's about, I want to show people who they are, warts and all. There's an artifact of the warts and all, right? And I also think that in a moment that is as politically urgent as the one that we're in, I think we can also push ourselves as creatives, as producers, and as financiers to say, we need to not just tell the stories of where we are now, but of who we can be. Because when we start to drop our privilege, we might, people I think are afraid, like, am I going to lose my structural access? And I actually think when you drop privilege, you gain your humanity. Because in this process, we are so diminished and we lose so much of our humanity that we don't even know. That's what caste steals from us. And what I would love to see is like ways we could start incorporating stories and larger mythologies that show who we could be in a future where caste is utterly annihilated and we are all free.
I also, Thenmozhi, I love everything that you are saying. And I think just to highlight, because you said it before, to also highlight the stories of people who have different gender preferences and are in partnerships that are unconventional in that sense. And I think the Indian community has so much to offer and teach the rest of us on that front, just historically and from different communities as well, that I would love to see. And before I turn it over to you, Smriti, for like the closing comments and things, I want to say that I have the privilege of being a bridge between many of you, because I know you all outside of, not all of you, but many of you I know outside of this platform and your activist work. And Smriti is one of those people, and I've heard her say this so many times of bringing people along for the ride with her, and she's saying it today in terms of not wanting to be the gatekeeper. So I'm really hopeful that this conversation leads to different opportunities for partnerships across these different lines for all of us. And since I am Iranian, I always have to quote some sort of poetic moment in Hafez, which says, the subject for tonight is love, and for tomorrow as well. And I really feel like that has been shared in this conversation. So I will turn it over to you, Smriti, to make some final comments, and we can wrap it up from there.
I just want to thank everyone for all of your comments and your insights. It's truly valuable. It's helping me with my understanding, which, recognizing, the platform that I do have, which is, not insignificant. It's important for me, to hear you and absorb what you're saying and move beyond my perspective and my narrow understanding of the world. So, I'm here to be pushed so that I can push. And I just appreciate everything everyone was saying and all the questions that came in. And thank you, Matthews, for putting this together.
Thank you for doing it. Also, I think if there are things, I should say, I don't know if there was a question still of what we can hope to see from season 2. Is there a season 2? Is that still in talks, or?
Not officially yet. We'll see. We haven't gotten official word yet. I think it'll be a few more weeks before we know for sure. We'll, like I said, I'm going to push as hard as I can. It's when you're working within a studio system with other partners and, other voices at the table, I can't do everything. I don't have complete control over this particular, product. And also when you're making something that's documentary, there are aspects that are hard to control, like who is willing to be a participant on a show, what I'm hoping is that now that, the first season is out there and people are able to see what, the format of the show is, the structure of the show is, all of that. And I have been seeing this. There's been a lot more people who have been reaching out, asking about a season 2, interested in participating in a season 2, who are from much different backgrounds than what we had in season 1. So I hope that the first season was, our attempt at kicking the hornet's nest, and, the next season we can, push the conversation further and push the, what we see on the screen even further. So fingers crossed.
Thank you. Christina, Meena, Thenmozhi, Smriti, thank you, thank you, thank you. There's a comment that I love here that says someone needs to green light Love Daisy style. So Lena, I agree. And I thank all of you for taking the time and for sharing your experiences, both painful and thoughtful. So thank you for all of it. And I hope that we can continue to have these conversations amongst ourselves and amongst all communities of color as we hold ourselves accountable moving forward. So thank you. Have a wonderful
Thank you.
And make sure everyone follow all these wonderful groups, the International Dalit Solidarity Fund, Equality Labs. Christina, you have to tell me and Smriti, your Twitter handles so people follow you.
Yeah, I'm on at CastleChris1.
And I'm at Smriti Mundhra everywhere.
And I'm at Dalit Diva. And also just wanted to say J Beam and J Savitri, which is how we close our Dalit gatherings. So it's really powerful for people to step into our world. So thank you guys.
J Beam.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you guys so much.